We could not see them. We could only see the fire coming from nowhere, like ghosts in the sand. Those words belong to an Iraqi Republican Guard officer captured after the Battle of 73 Easting. His unit had T-72 tanks dug into prepared positions. They had range cards. They had overlapping fields of fire. None of it mattered. Captain H.R. McMaster commanded Eagle Troop, 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment. 26 February 1991. His M1 Abrams pushed east into a shamal sandstorm that cut visibility to less than 100 meters with the naked eye. Sand blasted the hull. The wind rocked the turret. McMaster stood in the commander's hatch because he refused to button up. He wanted peripheral awareness, even if the grit shredded his face. His gunner, Staff Sergeant Craig Koch, sat below him in a different war entirely. Koch watched the world through thermal imaging, clean white silhouettes against cool black ground. The storm didn't exist on his screen. Koch called contacts, 1,800 meters, then 1,400. Iraqi tanks, hull down in a defensive line along a barely visible ridge. McMaster couldn't see a single one of them with his own eyes. The horizon had dissolved into a brown wall of nothing. He fought the battle through Koch's voice, and the thermal display piped to his own extension. The Iraqi tankers in those T-72s had Soviet-era infrared searchlights, active systems that worked by flooding a target with an infrared beam and reading the reflection. Useful on a clear night. In a sandstorm, the beams scattered into useless noise about 300 meters out. Their optical sights performed worse. They sat in fighting positions they'd spent days preparing, staring into brown murk, waiting for a target to emerge at a range where they could actually engage it. The first round from McMaster's Abrams hit a T-72 at roughly 1,500 meters. The Iraqi crew never acquired Eagle Troop. The sabot round punched through the turret face, and the ammunition cooked off in a jet of flame visible even through the storm. Koch traversed right. Second target. McMaster gave the command. The loader slammed another 120-millimeter round home. The breach closed with a sound like a vault door. You feel that concussion in your teeth, in your sternum before you hear it. Most people have never heard this story in full. The textbooks give it 2 paragraphs. The real details live in after-action reports and oral histories that almost nobody reads. If this kind of breakdown matters to you, a like and subscribe keep it coming. Drop a comment if you've studied 73 Easting before. I want to know what version you got. Eagle Troop covered 4 kilometers in 23 minutes. McMaster's tank alone destroyed 8 Iraqi armored vehicles. The troop as a whole killed 28 tanks, 16 personnel carriers, and 30 trucks. 0 American fatalities. 1 Abrams took a hit from a T-72 round that failed to penetrate. It gouged the composite armor and left a scar the crew reportedly kept as a souvenir. The thermal sights changed everything about this engagement. The Iraqis had no framework for understanding what hit them. Their doctrine assumed engagements would begin at 800 to 1,000 meters, visual range in decent conditions, less in bad weather. American crews opened fire at triple that distance in 0 visibility. The Iraqi defensive plan depended on forcing attackers into a kill zone at close range. The kill zone never activated. Every Republican Guard tank died before its crew identified a target. That captured officers' phrase, "ghosts in the sand," keeps showing up in accounts of the Gulf War. Different units, different sectors, same confusion. Iraqi tankers described American vehicles appearing as muzzle flashes with no visible source. A few believed they faced helicopters, while others assumed aircraft. The idea that a tank could find you, track you, and kill you in a sandstorm at 1.5 miles simply did not register as possible. McMaster's after-action review uses clinical language. Koch's thermal sight provided decisive overmatch in degraded conditions. The Iraqi officer's version communicated something the official report didn't. Ghosts don't follow doctrine. You can't range a ghost. The technology gap cost 15 years and more money than most countries spend on their entire military. The bet started in the early 70s, when American war planners stared at maps of the Fulda Gap and ran the arithmetic on Soviet tank divisions. The numbers were ugly. NATO faced a 3-to-1 disadvantage in armor along the Central European front, maybe 4-to-1 in some sectors. The Red Army could mass T-62s and T-72s in echelons deep enough to absorb catastrophic losses and keep rolling west. Traditional doctrine said you matched tanks with tanks. America couldn't build them fast enough. So a different question emerged inside the Pentagon. What if you didn't need to match them one for one? What if every American tank killed 3 Soviet tanks before taking fire? That required seeing first. General William Dupuy, first commander of the Army's Training and Doctrine Command, drove this idea with an intensity that irritated nearly everyone around him. Dupuy had commanded an infantry division in Vietnam and came home convinced the Army had forgotten how to fight a conventional war. His 1976 Field Manual 100-5, Operations, rewrote American ground doctrine around a single concept. Firepower wins when directed by superior observation. Superior eyes, not superior numbers or courage. The thermal sight program that eventually produced the AN/VAS-3 for the Abrams grew out of that doctrinal shift. Texas Instruments won the contract in 1979. The system detected infrared radiation emitted by objects, passive detection, no beam to scatter, no searchlight to betray your position. A running engine at 2,000 meters showed up like a campfire on a dark night. Even a tank that had been sitting cold for hours retained enough thermal differential from the surrounding terrain to register as a distinct shape. The sensor didn't care about fog, dust, smoke, darkness. It read heat. Everything else fell away. The Soviets knew this capability existed. Their intelligence services tracked the program through open-source defense publications. Hughes Aircraft and Texas Instruments both presented at unclassified symposiums throughout the early 80s. Soviet technical assessments, declassified after the Cold War, acknowledged that American thermal sights represented a qualitative advantage in reduced visibility engagements. Their proposed counter was a combination of thermal signature reduction and smoke screening. Both solutions stayed mostly theoretical. Production line T-72s rolling off the Uralvagon-Zavod factory in Nizhny Tagil carried the same TPN-1-49-23 night sight they'd always carried. Active infrared, 700 meters effective range on a good night. The gap between what Soviet planners knew and what Soviet factories produced tells you something about how centralized economies handle urgent technical problems. They don't. Reports circulated and committees met, but production schedules never changed. Dupuy retired in 1977. He never saw his doctrine tested in the desert. But the field manual he wrote contained a phrase that Koch and McMaster proved 14 years later without ever reading it. The force that sees first shoots first. The force that shoots first wins. By February 1991, the Iraqi Republican Guard sat in positions designed for a war where both sides went blind at the same distance. One side had rewritten the rules on blindness itself. Why did the Soviets stick with active infrared when they knew passive thermal existed? The answer involves physics, manufacturing capacity, and a procurement system that rewarded meeting quotas over meeting threats. Active infrared works like a flashlight in a dark room. You mount an infrared searchlight on the tank, switch it on, and the beam bounces off whatever sits in front of you. Your sight reads the reflection and builds an image. The L2G searchlight on a T-72 threw a beam that could illuminate targets out to roughly 800 meters under ideal conditions. Clear night, no dust, no rain. The problem, obvious to anyone who thought about it for more than 30 seconds, is that the beam travels in both directions. Any opponent equipped with even a basic infrared detector could see that searchlight from kilometers away. Lieutenant Colonel Douglas Grunewald, who commanded a battalion of M1s during Desert Storm, put it about as plainly as the English language allows. It's like fighting with a flashlight taped to your forehead. You can see one thing, everyone else can see you. Passive thermal needs no beam. The AN/VAS-2 and its successor, the AN/VSG-2, sat behind their optics and listened to the heat radiating off the world. Silent collection. No emission, no signature. A Soviet tank commander switching on his infrared searchlight during a night engagement against an Abrams crew didn't just fail to gain an advantage, he painted a targeting beacon on his own turret. Soviet optical engineers understood this vulnerability by the mid-70s. Technical institutes in Leningrad and Moscow produced working passive thermal prototypes using mercury-cadmium telluride detector arrays, the same fundamental technology the Americans pursued. The prototypes performed adequately in controlled testing. Manufacturing them at scale required semiconductor fabrication techniques that Soviet industry couldn't sustain at the purity levels needed. Mercury-cadmium telluride crystals demand extraordinary precision in their growth process, parts per million contamination thresholds that American facilities met through commercial semiconductor infrastructure built for entirely different markets. The Soviets lacked that civilian industrial base. Their detector arrays suffered from high defect rates and inconsistent sensitivity, with most units dying well short of their rated operational lifespans. A 1983 assessment from the Vavilov State Optical Institute, partially translated in a Defense Intelligence Agency summary from 1986, described production yields as insufficient for series implementation. So, the T-72 kept its searchlight. The T-80 received a slightly improved version called the TPN 4-49 Buran. Still active infrared, still a beacon. By the time Iraqi crews inherited these systems, the technology gap had widened to something closer to a generational divide. American gunners hunted in silence. Iraqi gunners announced themselves the moment they tried to see. 16:30 hours at local time, 26 February 1991. The shamal had blown for 6 hours straight. Inside an M1 Abrams, the sand made a sound, not wind howling or grains pattering, a continuous high-pitched hiss against the hull, like static on a dead radio channel turned up too loud. Fine particulate found every seal, every gap. Crews breathed through cloth wrapped across their faces. The stuff collected in the corners of your eyes and turned your saliva to paste. Sergeant First Class Lawrence Mueller, a platoon sergeant in Ghost Troop operating north of McMaster's Axis, told Army historians that the grit worked into his neck and ground against his skin under the Nomex hood until it felt like a slow-motion chemical burn. That detail comes from an oral history archived at the Army War College. Most accounts skip it. The sun dropped toward the horizon somewhere behind that wall of brown. Nobody saw it go. Daylight didn't end. It dimmed, degree by degree, until the hiss outside the hull existed in near-total darkness. Two conditions that individually degraded Iraqi optics to uselessness now stacked on top of each other. Sandstorm plus night. Their sights needed either clear air or a functioning searchlight, and now they had neither. The Republican Guard's Tawakalna Division held a line running roughly north-south along the 73 easting grid line. They'd occupied these positions for days. Berms sculpted to turret height. Ammunition staged in ready racks. Fuel topped off. Communications wire buried between fighting positions so American signals intelligence couldn't intercept radio traffic. This represented competent defensive preparation by any standard. Colonel Mohammed al-Khazraji commanded the brigade sector facing Eagle Troops' approach. His name appears in captured Iraqi documents, but almost nowhere in Western accounts. He positioned his T-72s in a staggered pattern with interlocking fields of fire designed to channel attackers into prepared kill sacks at 400 to 600 meters. 400 to 600 meters. That range mattered because al-Khazraji's gunners could reliably identify and engage targets at that distance under normal visibility. Their doctrine and rehearsals all assumed the fight would happen there. The defensive geometry made sense against an opponent operating under the same visual constraints. Al-Khazraji's men could hear the storm, but couldn't measure what it meant for the approaching Americans. Some crews reportedly shut down their engines to conserve fuel and reduce maintenance wear from sand ingestion. Smart practice for a force expecting to fight a defensive battle at short range. Cold engines also meant reduced thermal signatures, though that calculation required knowledge of thermal imaging that most Iraqi tank commanders simply didn't possess. They made the right decision for the wrong war. By 1700 hours, the temperature differential between a dug-in T-72 and the surrounding desert sand had narrowed to roughly 4 degrees Celsius. The AN/VAS-3 didn't care. 4 degrees registered as a clean, bright rectangle on the gunner's display. Koch and every other American gunner rolling east could read those shapes from 2 kilometers out. The Republican Guard waited in darkness for enemies they expected to share it. "I felt like I was cheating," Staff Sergeant Craig Koch said that to an interviewer in 1993. He meant it as a compliment to the machine. Eagle Troop crossed the 69 Easting at 1712 hours, moving east at roughly 15 kilometers per hour. McMaster's 9 Abrams tanks advanced in a wedge formation, each gunner locked into his thermal sight, scanning overlapping sectors. Koch sat in the gunner's seat of McMaster's tank and watched the green and black display paint a world that didn't exist to the naked eye. At 2,200 meters, the first rectangular shape materialized on his screen, unmistakable geometry against the organic clutter of sand berms and scrub. A T-72 hull-down gun tube oriented southwest. Koch called it. McMaster confirmed. The laser rangefinder returned 2,300 meters. Koch laid the crosshair on the hull turret junction, the weakest point in the T-72's frontal armor profile, and pressed the trigger. The M256 smoothbore gun fired a 105mm silver bullet, an M829 armor-piercing, fin-stabilized discarding sabot round, a depleted uranium penetrator moving at 1,600 meters per second. The time of flight to target at that range ran under 2 seconds. Koch didn't blink before the round arrived. The T-72's turret separated from its hull in a vertical column of fire. Ammunition cook-off. The carousel autoloader that Soviet designers installed beneath the turret ring stored propellant charges in a circle around the crew compartment floor. Any penetration of the hull sent superheated fragments into that ring. The crew never had a chance to understand what killed them. 3 men inside, driver, gunner, commander, dead before the sound of the Abrams gun reached their position. Koch traversed right. Second target, 2,500 meters. Same sequence. Rangefinder, crosshair, trigger. Another turret popped skyward on a pillar of white-orange flame. The Iraqi defensive line existed on his thermal display as a series of bright shapes arranged in the staggered pattern al-Khazraji had designed for a fight at 500 meters. Koch engaged them at 5 times that distance. Across Eagle Troop's frontage, the same thing happened simultaneously. Sergeant First Class James Bushnell's tank killed 2 T-72s in under 30 seconds. Staff Sergeant Michael Grubin engaged a BMP-1 infantry fighting vehicle that exploded so violently the thermal bloom whited out his display for 4 seconds. The troop's after-action report logs the first 8 kills in under 4 minutes. The Iraqi crews facing this onslaught experienced something categorically different from combat. They experienced annihilation without context. Tanks to their left and right detonated. No muzzle flash visible through the storm. No engine sound audible over the wind. The source of fire sat beyond the theoretical maximum range of their main guns, even in daylight, and they couldn't see 20 meters. Some crews attempted to start their engines. The thermal signature of an igniting diesel motor flared on American screens like a signal flare, drawing immediate fire. Others abandoned their vehicles and ran into the sand. A few, and captured Iraqi officers confirmed this in debriefs, believed they faced air attack rather than tanks. Ground vehicles didn't kill from that distance. That wasn't how armor worked. It worked now. 41 minutes separated Eagle Troop's first contact from the destruction of al-Khazraji's entire forward defensive line. Koch's crew alone accounted for 6 confirmed kills during the engagement. Fuel state read 63%. Ammunition expenditure sat at less than a quarter of the combat load. McMaster pushed the troop forward without pausing. How many times can you repeat a massacre before it stops feeling like war and starts feeling like something else? Eagle Troop's 41 minutes at 73 Easting played out in parallel across a front stretching 240 kilometers. Ghost Troop hit the Tawakalna's northern flank at 1740 hours. Iron Troop struck a mechanized infantry battalion dug in 3 kilometers south. 1st Armored Division's 2nd Brigade rolled into the Medina Division's security zone at 1900 hours. Every engagement followed the same script: American thermal sights finding Iraqi armor in total darkness, Iraqi crews dying without ever acquiring a target. The thermal blooms became their own kind of weather. When a T-72's ammunition carousel cooked off, the explosion registered on gunner displays as a white-hot flare that washed the screen for 3 to 5 seconds before the automatic gain control compensated. Sergeant Donald Randall, a gunner in 1st Armored Division, described the color as green going to pure white, like staring at a welding arc through night vision. Multiply that by dozens of vehicles detonating across a 10-kilometer front. The desert floor pulsed. The heat from burning diesel and propellant created its own thermal signature problem for American crews. Not danger, just clutter. Destroyed vehicles radiated so intensely they masked targets behind them. Gunners learned to look past the bright spots, scanning the cooler margins where surviving tanks might sit. Most surviving tanks held crews already dead from overpressure or shrapnel thrown by neighboring vehicles. A captured Republican Guard lieutenant from the Medina Division told his debriefers that he climbed out of his BMP after both vehicles on his flanks exploded and walked east into the storm because east seemed like the direction away from whatever had found them. He walked for 6 hours. American infantry from the 1st Infantry Division picked him up at 0300 on 27 February, 7 kilometers from his fighting position, deaf in his left ear from the concussions, bootless because he'd lost them in the sand. His company had fielded 14 armored vehicles, all 14 burned. The numbers from that single night resist easy comprehension. 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment destroyed 29 tanks, 24 armored personnel carriers, and 39 trucks. 1st Armored Division's tally ran higher, more than 112 armored vehicles confirmed destroyed between nightfall and dawn. 3rd Armored Division added another 86. These counts come from unit after-action reports, cross-referenced, against aerial survey photography conducted on 28 February. Some wrecks burned so completely that positive identification required chemical analysis of the remaining metal. 0 Abrams tanks lost to Iraqi direct fire across all 3 divisions that night. The Republican Guard entered the darkness expecting a fair fight. American taxpayers had spent 15 years and billions of dollars ensuring they'd never get one. Western defense analysts spent the 90s blaming the T-72. Wrong target. The tank itself performed within its design parameters. Soviet engineers built it to absorb a hit from a 105mm NATO round at combat range and keep fighting. Iraqi T-72s carried composite armor inserts on the turret front rated against kinetic penetrators up to roughly 400mm of rolled homogeneous steel equivalent, respectable numbers for a 1970s design. The M829 Sabot round punched through 600mm. So yes, the armor lost that matchup. But armor always loses eventually. Every generation of tank gets killed by the next generation of round. That cycle runs back to 1916. Strip the T-72 out of the equation entirely. Give Al-Khazraji's brigade the T-80, the Soviet Union's actual frontline tank in 1991. With laminate armor, 125mm smoothbore, laser rangefinder, better fire control. Change the outcome? Not by a single burning hull. The T-80 carried the TPN-449 night sight. Active infrared, same technology family as the T-72 system, marginally improved in resolution. Maximum effective range in darkness topped out around 800 meters under ideal atmospheric conditions. Clear skies, no precipitation, no sand. During a shamal at night, that range collapsed to functionally 0. A T-80 crew sitting in the path of Eagle Troop would have died identically to every T-72 crew. Blind, confused, turret spinning toward a threat they sensed but couldn't locate. A Swedish defense researcher named Lars Eriksson published a technical comparison in 1994 that made this point with unusual clarity. His paper circulated through NATO working groups but never reached a wide audience. It appeared in a Swedish-language journal called Kungliga Krigsvetenskapsakademiens Handlingar och Tidskrift, which translates roughly to Proceedings of the Royal Academy of War Sciences. The title alone guaranteed obscurity. Eriksson obtained thermal performance data on 7 Soviet bloc night vision systems through channels he declined to specify and ran them against measured atmospheric conditions from the Kuwait Theater of Operations. His conclusion used language that a military procurement journal almost never employs. He called the gap structurally irreversible within the Soviet industrial framework, meaning the problem couldn't be fixed with better lenses or upgraded electronics. The entire manufacturing base for detector arrays, cryogenic cooling units, signal processing chips, none of it existed in the Soviet ecosystem at the required scale or precision. The real asymmetry at 73 Easting ran deeper than any single weapons platform. Koch's thermal sight converted darkness from a shared handicap into an American monopoly on information. Every tactical advantage flowed downstream from that single fact. Range advantage, meaningless without target acquisition. Armor advantage, irrelevant if you shoot first. The thermal imager sat upstream of all of it, first link in the kill chain. Give the Republican Guard a T-90, a Challenger 2, a Leopard 2A4, any tank fielded by any nation in 1991 that lacked an equivalent thermal imaging suite, and the mathematics of that night stay fixed. Crews die in their vehicles without returning effective fire. The American defense establishment understood this. A Rand Corporation study completed in 1993, 640 pages of analysis on Desert Storm lethality data, devoted exactly 11 pages to the thermal sight advantage. 11 pages out of 640. The authors buried the most important variable in the war inside a subsection titled Sensor Contributions to Engagement Outcomes. The word revolutionary appears nowhere in those 11 pages. The data screams it. What does a soldier say when he loses a battle he never fought? The debriefs started on 27 February at a temporary processing facility south of Safwan. U.S. Army intelligence officers from the 513 Military Intelligence Brigade sat across folding tables from Republican Guard prisoners and asked them to reconstruct engagements that had lasted, in most cases, under 5 minutes. The transcripts fill 11 binders housed at the National Defense University archives. Most remain partially redacted. What survives tells a story the thermal imaging data cannot. Captain Samir Al-Rawi commanded a company of T-72s in the Tawakalna Division's 18th Brigade. His unit occupied prepared positions along a low ridge 4 kilometers east of the 73 Easting. Al-Rawi told his interviewer, a Major Patricia Collings, according to the transcript header, that at approximately 17:30 hours on 26 February, the tank to his immediate left exploded. He felt the concussion through the hull of his own vehicle, a pressure wave that compressed his chest and left a ringing in both ears that persisted through the interview 48 hours later. He ordered his gunner to traverse toward the source of fire. The gunner reported nothing visible through his optical sight, nothing through the infrared. Al-Rawi opened his hatch and stood in the turret, wind-driven sand tearing at exposed skin on his face and hands, temperature around 7 degrees Celsius, visibility he estimated at 10 to 15 meters. He saw fire to his left, fire behind him. The second tank in his platoon detonated while he watched, close enough that he felt heat on his face from 30 meters away, a flash that printed itself on his retinas for minutes afterward. He dropped back inside and ordered his driver to start the engine and reverse out of position. The engine turned over. 14 seconds later, Al-Rawi counted, he told Collings, because counting kept him from screaming. A round struck the berm directly in front of his hull. Sand and fragmented concrete sprayed across his vision blocks. A miss, the only American miss recorded in his sector that evening. His driver reversed 11 meters before a sabot round entered the right side of the hull below the turret ring. The penetrator passed through the crew compartment at an angle, killing the gunner instantly, igniting 2 propellant charges in the autoloader carousel and exiting through the left hull plate. Al-Rawi and his driver escaped through their respective hatches before the ammunition cooked off. The loader did not. Al-Rawi couldn't say whether the loader had already died from the initial penetration or burned alive in the secondary explosion. The transcript notes that Al-Rawi paused for approximately 2 minutes at this point in the interview. Collings asked him how many enemy vehicles he observed during the engagement. Al-Rawi's answer, translated from Arabic, "None. I saw none. I heard nothing except explosions. My men died fighting something that wasn't there." Other interviews echo that language with eerie consistency. Sergeant Tariq Hassan from the Medina Division's 14th Brigade described thunder from an empty sky. Lieutenant Faisal Al-Juburi, captured near Objective Norfolk, told a different interviewer that his battalion commander radioed at 18:05 hours to report contact with aircraft or guided missiles and requested anti-air support. The battalion commander received no response. His communications vehicle had already burned. Across the 11 binders, a pattern crystallizes. Iraqi officers consistently overestimated the size of the American force by factors of 3 to 5. They assumed multiple axes of attack when a single troop frontage had engaged them. They reported weapon systems that didn't exist in the theater, laser weapons, in 2 separate interviews. When you can't see what's killing you, you invent something you could theoretically fight back against. Lasers can be countered. Invisible tanks, operating in a sandstorm at 2,000 meters, cannot. 357 Republican Guard soldiers from the Tawakalna Division entered captivity between 26 and 28 February. 41% reported hearing loss. 22% exhibited symptoms consistent with acute stress reaction. The division had fielded roughly 280 tanks before the ground war. Fewer than 40 survived the night of 26 February in operational condition. Most of those survived because American units bypassed their positions in the dark, not because their crews did anything right. Al-Rawi's loader carried no identification when recovery teams cataloged the vehicle in March. The personnel file lists him as unidentified crew member, T-72 number 417. The ghost turned out to have a paper trail, 15 years long. McMaster's troop didn't stumble into dominance. Every advantage that materialized on February 26th traced back to a specific budget line, a specific contract, a specific argument won inside the Pentagon during the Carter and Reagan years. The thermal sight, Texas Instruments 1977 Common Module Flyer Program, initial unit cost north of $200,000 at a time, when an entire M60 Patton tank cost about $700,000. The depleted uranium sabot round development initiated at Picatinny Arsenal in 1973. Test fired against captured Soviet armor samples obtained through channels the Army still declines to discuss. The Honeywell AGT 1500 turbine engine that let the Abrams sprint at 45 miles per hour across terrain that bogged T-72s to their road wheels. The composite armor array, classified for decades, incorporating materials and geometry derived from British Chobham research, but refined at Aberdeen Proving Ground through hundreds of ballistic tests against every Soviet munition American intelligence could acquire or replicate. Each component solved a problem identified by men who expected to fight the Third Shock Army in Germany. They built for the Fulda Gap. They got Kuwait. The technology transferred perfectly because the underlying problem, Soviet-designed armor, Soviet-designed ammunition, Soviet-designed doctrine, transferred perfectly too. Iraq bought the Soviet export catalog. America spent 2 decades building the counter catalog. The shamal just removed the last variable that might have offered the Iraqis a chance. Shared visual range. Koch's thermal sight deleted that variable at 16:30 hours. From that moment, doctrine executed itself. McMaster gave orders. His crews followed training. The tanks performed to specification. The rounds flew where the ballistic computers said they'd fly. The targets died where the thermal signatures said they sat. The entire engagement operated within parameters the Army had rehearsed at the National Training Center in Fort Irwin, California, for 9 consecutive years before Desert Storm. Simulated Soviet motor rifle regiments dug into desert positions, attacked by American armor in reduced visibility. Eagle Troop had run that exercise 11 times. The 12th time counted. The Soviet officers who designed the Tawakalna's defensive positions would have recognized the geometry from their own manuals. Interlocking fields of fire. Reverse slope positions to mask thermal signatures. Except the sand berms the Iraqis built radiated stored daytime heat at different rates than the surrounding desert floor, which meant Koch's thermal display outlined every fighting position in crisp contrast, like chalk marks on a blackboard. The berms designed to hide them became the signatures that killed them. A 1992 Army Research Laboratory analysis of thermal terrain mapping from the battle noted this effect with clinical detachment. The word they used, counterproductive, belongs in a performance review, not a combat assessment. Thousands of man-hours digging positions that functioned as target indicators. The crews who built those berms felt the grit of compacted sand under their fingernails, hauled sandbags in 40-degree heat for weeks, reinforced overhead cover against air attack. All of it useless against a sensor that read the Earth's temperature to 1/10 of a degree. The Iraqi engineering effort amounted to painting bullseyes on their own foreheads in a frequency of light they couldn't perceive. The word for this isn't incompetence, it's an information asymmetry so total it bends the definition of combat. The Tawakalna Division ceased to exist as a fighting formation by 0600 hours on 27 February 1991, approximately 14 hours of ground contact. The division lost an estimated 247 of its approximately 280 tanks, along with more than 300 other armored vehicles. American forces across all units engaged with the Tawakalna suffered 6 Abrams damaged, 1 to a mine, 2 to friendly fire, 3 to mechanical failure, 0 to Iraqi direct fire. Koch fired 26 main gun rounds during the Battle of 73 Easting. He hit with 24. McMaster's entire troop expended less than half its basic ammunition load, destroying a force that outnumbered it roughly 5 to 1. The engagement lasted 41 minutes, 15 years of investment, billions of dollars in development contracts, thousands of engineers and physicists and metallurgists and optics specialists. 41 minutes. McMaster received the Silver Star. Koch received the Bronze Star with Valor Device. The medal citation runs 4 paragraphs and mentions the thermal sight exactly 0 times. A photograph from March 1991 shows T-72 number 417 sitting in the desert with its turret blown 30 feet from the hull, sand already drifting against the treads.